set out towards the city, things leap out at me. And these are not things that I can change, still less control. In a capital city, I'm dwarfed, overawed, intimidated. And then a friendly voice says, you can be part of this. And that's when it feels like I don't really need to bother. However, I've just heard of the Westminster government's new strapline about controlling the virus. This betrays something of an attitude to nature as an object to dominate. The assumption that we can and ought to be completely in control. That narrow view of an enemy to annihilate rather than a situation to transform. Elsewhere, people are still talking of fighting climate change rather than changing ourselves. This is everything other than we need to learn. From a quarter of a century as a minister, I know I can't make anyone do anything. And as I come and go in a capital city, this is powerfully reinforced. It's not just the public buildings and the banks that do it, but even the churches. It's amazing that the model so many of these churches went for was that of a classical temple. And of course the castle.
No one provokes me and gets away with it.
Centuries of pain, violence and misery. And that's the brutal starting point. Agree or be a barbarian. Maybe it's only the seagulls and pigeons that manage to rise above it. The city embodies something of the same lie that taunted Jesus. All you have to do is bow down and worship me, and everything will be all right. So in that way, even the most loving desire to change things is often talked out of court by this amiable, prestigious demon, the capital city demon, who belittles you, but also seems to allow you a way in. And that's a way that Paul, as a Roman citizen, had accepted. He went with the flow in the hope that his words would be wind assisted. So the question is how to challenge a violently unjust system without rubbing everyone up the wrong way who depends on it. And this missionary called Paul decided to give it a go, not by screaming and shouting. He was far too crafty for that. But the question remains, what did he risk in the process? Not many people notice that Pope Francis, in his truly groundbreaking encyclical, and that's a letter from a pope to the faithful, Pope Francis clearly felt pressure to quote previous popes who were putting things very differently without that emphasis on relationship and partnership with creation, almost personally. But that's the culture into which he was writing. And I think he gets away with it while also being aware that just being Pope is not going to be firm enough ground to stand on. He still has to convince, he still has to earn a hearing, and in that sense, he is a bit like Paul in Athens. What he has showed is that with a hint of common ground, with patience, with impatience, respect and love, and God willing, you can pull it off. Not to set aside our differences, but to bring our diversity to bear on what we face today. It wasn't that anything strangely new was being introduced, but rather that over time we have in Christianity inadvertently moved from the bare mention of the value and personal character of fellow creatures, because their blindingly obvious presence is taken for granted. We've moved to the active exclusion of the same on the grounds of that scant mention. Paul in Acts 17 was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. Now, we're not without such cause for distress ourselves. We have plenty of plinths, plenty of idols. As I go through the city, the origins of institutions, buildings, traditions are almost all highly questionable. Great monuments to slave owners, those who went abroad and under the umbrella of empire and commerce
Exploited and did violence to the peoples of the world.
And how's this for an idol? Viscount Melville up there used his influence to delay the abolition of slavery for a full 15 years. Think of the amount of suffering that involves. And there he is, up on his column still, protected by law. And bouncing along on the cobbles here in Newtown, I'm aware that this place is what it is because of money from slavery. And I realise that without these restrictions, I wouldn't be having these thoughts, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today. What matters is not whether we're restricted, but what we do creatively with those restrictions. Is it just a wee ride out of the centre and we come across this plant which is involved essentially in manufacturing death. Piously and truthfully, it claims on its website that it contributes to the balance of payments, and if you also look, there are reviews from employees saying how kind and considerate the management are, and all that is true. But so is the truth of what they're making here. How many of these truths does it take to stop your conversion in its tracks for fear you might upset someone? The thing is that idols are powerful because it makes sense to worship them. They're powerful because people think it's worthwhile. But this is the city experience. The city knows best, the system knows best, and it's in your interest to support it. We are part of what needs to change. And the problem is not the lie, but the truth of it.
Looks like yet another classical temple.
And this being Edinburgh, not London, I can just stroll past the residence of the First Minister. It's called Bute House. It's named after the Marquis of Butes.
Now, he was a philanthropist, but
he built his playgrounds with the blood of exploited miners.
Now, what Paul did bring,
whilst biting his lip about the idols, was respect for things and people he believed God wanted to change. Reuse, recycle, repurpose, convert. And that continuing process of conversion is for our own faith as much as for anything else. Paul had no access to any of the usual solutions: money, power, violence, privilege, imported expert consultants, honours, prestige. But he did come genuinely with the welfare of his hearers at heart. An inclusive message which included them and appreciated their best points, whilst being clear about what needed to change. Dwellers in a common home can't afford to have enemies. We can't compel. Like Paul, our options are limited to trying to convince. The thing is that many, if not most people, bow down and worship something other than God, but what Paul shows is that God does not give up on them. Paul may have been small, powerless, deluded, foreign, but he discovered what he could do and did it anyway.